There is a silence in the sacred texts that no theologian has been able to fully explain until today. Genesis records the names of the male Nephilim, but the females, the daughters, are unnamed. However, they existed, and their trace did not disappear with the universal flood, but rather transformed into an eternal myth. What happens when an ancient civilization encounters something it cannot name without destroying its own faith? It turns him into a legend. It distorts him. It makes him monstrous. And then it orders that no one ever question or investigate him. That is exactly what happened with Medusa, and the historical evidence leads directly to the sacred Mount Hermon. The Book of Enoch, preserved intact only in the Ethiopian tradition, reveals that 200 celestial beings descended. Those beings, called the Watchers, took human wives and begot a race of supernatural power. The texts focus on warrior men, giants, renowned men who sowed terror. But the Book of Giants, recovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, suggests something completely different. It speaks of female beings of mixed origin who carried knowledge that no human should possess. Rabbinic tradition preserves scattered references to women from Noah's generation with superhuman attributes. They were not simple women. They were bearers of a heritage that the scribes chose not to record clearly. And the reason for that silence is more unsettling than the silence itself. Someone wanted them to be forgotten forever. Genesis states that the flood exterminated the Nephilim. However, they reappear in Numbers 13:33. This contradiction has not been resolved by any theological school with an answer that satisfies logic, unless it is considered a possibility that the canonical texts did not want to articulate directly to the faithful. That the female line survived, invisible to the scribes who only recorded lineage through the paternal line. That the daughters of the Watchers were not destroyed by the waters of the flood, but found another way. And that path left marks in every ancient culture on the planet, marks too precise to be a coincidence. The Greeks called them gorgons. The Babylonians sculpted them on the walls of their most sacred temples. The Slavic tradition feared them as rusalki. West Africa has known them as mami wata since time immemorial. Japan recorded the Ningyo more than 1,000 years ago. Mesopotamia left tablets with descriptions of similar beings. None of these cultures had contact with each other at the time these parallel legends emerged. None. The pattern is identical to the female, superhuman bearer of forbidden knowledge, and ultimately eliminated or demonized. This is not mythology shared through accidental cultural contact. This is collective memory of a real event that occurred. And the actual event has a name in the oldest texts predating the canonical Bible: the fall of the Watchers. Now let's focus on Medusa, not on the version taught in modern schools, but on the original one. Before Hesiod wrote his Theogony, Medusa was not a terrible monster with hair of snakes. It was a chthonic deity, a being of the underworld associated with primordial wisdom and hidden knowledge. In the ancient world, snakes did not symbolize moral evil, but rather profound transformation and forbidden knowledge. In the Garden of Eden, it is the snakes who transmit knowledge. In Enoch, the Watchers do as well. The connection between snakes and supernatural knowledge appears in Sumerian, Akkadian, Egyptian, and Greek texts. Medusa is no exception to this pattern. Medusa is its most perfect and most deliberately distorted expression. According to the oldest Greek genealogy, Medusa was the daughter of Phorcys and Ceto, two primordial deities of the ocean. Phorco was the god of the deepest sea. the one who rules the abyssal waters where no sunlight ever reaches. Ceto was the living embodiment of oceanic danger, the completely unknown that lurks in the nameless depths. His 3 daughters, the Gorgons, lived at the absolute edges of the world, beyond any known horizon. But there is something that the Greek texts emphasize with truly strange insistence. Medusa was the only mortal. Her sisters, Stheno and Euryale, were immortal. Medusa was not. She was a hybrid, divine in power, mortal in origin. This distinction is not a minor detail. It is the key to everything the Greeks tried to conceal with their myth. An immortal being cannot be eliminated. A mortal being with divine power can. And that is exactly what happened. The Book of Enoch describes the same attributes in the children of the Watchers: superhuman power, mortality, because they were born of human mothers, and that humanity made them vulnerable in a way that their parents were not. Medusa embodies this duality with a precision that becomes impossible to ignore once it is clearly seen. Her gaze petrified. It was not an acquired curse. It was an innate ability present since her origin. In the context of the Nephilim, this type of power requires no additional supernatural explanation. It is inheritance. The apocryphal texts describe the children of the Watchers with abilities that human beings did not possess. Vision that penetrated the hearts of men, knowledge of the future, mastery over natural forces. Medusa simply had one of those gifts, and that gift was what made her unbearably dangerous to the gods. Because a hybrid creature with supernatural power that also possesses forbidden knowledge cannot be controlled. It can only be eliminated. And to justify that elimination, the power establishes that it must be turned into a monster. This is the pattern that repeats in all ancient civilizations. Demonization always precedes destruction. Lilith was turned into an evil demon before being permanently erased from the canonical Hebrew texts forever. Lamashtu was portrayed as a mortal enemy of children before completely disappearing from official Babylonian theology. The Egyptian Gorgon Mute was rewritten as a goddess of war before losing her association with knowledge. And Medusa was transformed into a monster before Perseus received the divine mission to behead her forever. Perseus's mission was not a heroic act. It was a suppression operation, ordered from Olympus itself. Athena provided him with the shield. Hermes gave him the winged sandals. The gods fully equipped Perseus. When the Greek gods arm a mortal hero against a single being, that being is not simply a monster. It is a real threat to the order that the gods had established, a threat that had to be eliminated. The Book of Enoch describes something identical. God commands the archangels to destroy the Nephilim on earth, not because they are evil in themselves, but because their existence represents a break in the established cosmic order. They are the result of a transgression, and their continued presence in the world keeps that transgression open. Medusa is that same transgression in Greek form. Her existence reminds us that something sacred was once violated. And the gods of Olympus, just like the god of Enoch, needed that dangerous memory to be completely erased. That's why Perseus doesn't just kill her, he takes her head, preserving the weapon while eliminating the source of her power. This is crucial. The head of Medusa continues to petrify even after death. The power survives the bearer. Exactly as in Enoch, the Nephilim die physically, but their spirits remain active on earth as demons. The power of hybrids does not disappear with their body. It transforms, disperses, and continues to act in the world. From the blood of Medusa, Pegasus and Chrysaor are born. Two beings of extraordinary power emerge from her lifeless body. In Enoch's cosmology, the death of the Nephilim does not extinguish their lineage, but transforms it into something new. The Greeks expressed it with images. The apocryphal texts expressed it with theology. The conclusion is identical. The death of a hybrid being does not close the cycle. It opens it to a new form of existence that escapes control. Now, it is necessary to examine where Medusa lived, because the geography of this myth is not arbitrary at all. Greek texts place it beyond the known ocean, in the regions to the north, or at the edge of the world. The Book of Enoch places the descent of the Watchers on Mount Hermon at the borders of the inhabited world. The Amazons, those warrior women of superhuman strength, are located in Anatolia, exactly the same area. Hesiod places the Gorgons near the sources of the ocean, in regions beyond all civilization. This shared geography is not poetic. It is the trace of a memory that repeats because it points to something real. The places where ancient texts locate superhuman female beings coincide with unsettling precision. And that coincidence outlines a map that conventional scholars have preferred to ignore for entire centuries. Mount Hermon, the north of Mesopotamia, the edges of the known world, always the same sacred territory. Because it was there that something happened that changed the course of human history forever, according to the oldest texts. And the civilizations that emerged afterward preserved the memory of that event in their most fundamental myths. Medusa is not a Greek invention. It is a Greek translation of something that happened before Greece existed. Before alphabetical writing existed, before the Mediterranean had a name, there were beings like that. And the cultures that encountered them recorded them in the only possible way, turning them into gods or monsters. The line between divinity and monster in the ancient world was always the same: the control of established power. What the gods could use was sacred. What escaped their control was monstrous and had to be destroyed. Medusa escaped control. Her gaze was hers. Her knowledge was hers. No one could instrumentalize her. That made her more dangerous than any army, more threatening than any titan chained in Tartarus. Because a single glance from her could turn any being to stone, including the agents of divine order. The Book of Enoch describes something analogous in the daughters of the Watchers that appear in the fragmentary texts. Beings that possessed knowledge that the angels should not have transmitted and that humans could not contain. Knowledge that transformed the possessor into something that could no longer be governed by any known law. The gaze of Medusa is exactly that metaphor of the power of forbidden knowledge, made visible and irresistible. And the only way to defeat her was not to look at her directly, only see her reflection, never face her head-on. Perseus used a polished shield as a mirror. He could not look at Medusa. He could only see his image reflected in the bronze. This is a perfect metaphor for how ancient civilizations dealt with the knowledge of the Nephilim. They could not completely deny it, but they also could not face it directly without their faith turning to stone. Then they reflected it, they distorted it, they turned it into a myth, and they killed the bearer of that original knowledge. What Perseus cut off was not just the head of a monster, it was direct access to primordial knowledge. And by cutting it, the Greeks believed they had solved the problem. But the knowledge continued to exist elsewhere. Because the knowledge of the Watchers was not only in Medusa, it was in all her sisters and descendants. I was in the Rusalki of the Slavic world, in the Sirens of the Mediterranean, in Mamiwata, in the ancient Japanese Ningyo. Each culture that came into contact with that knowledge preserved it differently, but with the same central core. A female being of mixed origin, bearer of supernatural wisdom, who was demonized and then silenced. The pattern repeats with too much precision to be a coincidence, and the coincidence has a name in the texts. It is called the Book of Enoch, and it describes exactly where that knowledge came from and why it had to be destroyed. Now it is necessary to pose the question that no conventional academic has dared to publicly ask. What if Medusa was not a Greek invention, but the accurate memory of a being that truly existed on Earth? What if the Gorgons are not fantasy, but the Mediterranean translation of the daughters of the Watchers? The answer requires accepting something that modern academia rejects, but that ancient texts assert outright. That the Watchers descended, that they joined with human women, that their descendants also had daughters. And those daughters, more invisible than their male siblings, survived in ways that the texts did not record. The scribes of ancient Israel counted lineage through the paternal line. Daughters did not inherit the official name. A daughter of the Nephilim, who married a man of seemingly human lineage, disappeared from the records. But their abilities did not disappear. Their knowledge did not disappear. Their genetic heritage did not disappear. And in the next generation, or the one after that, something could manifest that no one could explain rationally. This is exactly what the myth of Medusa describes: the resurgence of a power that was supposed to be extinct. Medusa does not live in the civilized world. She lives in the fringes, in the margins, where divine control is weaker. Because that was where those who could not be completely destroyed, but also could not remain, took refuge. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers chained in the depths, in the prisons of the underworld, his dead children, but their spirits wandering, and his daughters, the ones who survived, at the ends of the earth. Medusa at the edges of the ocean, the Sirens on the remote islands, the Rusalki in the deepest rivers. The geographical pattern is always the same. The margins, the boundaries, the places where civilization ends. Because that is where something can exist without being completely seen, without being completely known, without being destroyed. And that is where humanity's oldest memories kept what they could not name directly. There is a detail in the myth of Medusa that is generally overlooked, but is extraordinarily significant. Before being decapitated, Medusa was extraordinarily beautiful. The oldest Greek texts affirm this. Ovid, in his Metamorphoses, recounts a tradition that presents Medusa as the most beautiful of the three Gorgons. Poseidon desired her, and that desire was what triggered her transformation and eventually her bloody death. In the Book of Enoch, the Watchers descended precisely because they saw the beauty of human women. Supernatural beauty is a recurring characteristic of the descendants of the Watchers in the apocryphal texts. The daughters of the Nephilim in the rabbinic fragments are described as possessing a dangerous beauty, a beauty that attracted both men and divine beings alike, transcending established boundaries. Medusa possessed exactly that beauty, and that beauty was the first thing that made her a divine target. Poseidon desired her because she was superhumanly beautiful. Athena punished her because that desire violated her sacred temple. But the question that the texts do not answer is why Medusa was so extraordinarily beautiful in the first place. If it was simply a minor deity of the Greek pantheon, her beauty would not require any further explanation. But if she was a hybrid, a descendant of celestial beings and human women, her beauty has a precise source. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers as beings of light and glory. Their descendants inherited part of that glory, and that glory manifested itself in men as strength and stature, and in women as irresistible beauty. A beauty that was not simply aesthetic, but carried with it the weight of a visible, supernatural origin. The Greeks captured this detail. They preserved it, and they used it to explain why Medusa was pursued. But in doing so, unknowingly, they confirmed the lineage they were trying to reduce to a mere Greek cultural myth. Every element of the Medusa myth, examined in the light of the Book of Enoch, fits with unsettling precision. The supernatural beauty, the innate power, the location at the edges, the hybrid mortality, the divine decapitation. There is no element of the myth that contradicts the interpretation of Medusa as a direct daughter of the celestial Watchers. And there are multiple elements that only have a coherent explanation within that specific interpretative framework. The conventional academy rejects this interpretation because it requires accepting the historicity of apocryphal texts. But those same apocryphal texts were considered sacred by Jewish communities until the 1st century. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947, confirmed that the Book of Enoch was widely read. It was not a marginal text. It was part of the theological universe of those who wrote and preserved the biblical texts. To dismiss it as mythological fiction requires ignoring archaeological evidence that no scholar can refute. And if the Book of Enoch records real events, then the daughters of the Watchers were also real. And if they were real, they left traces in the cultures of the ancient world that we can still read if we know where to look. Medusa is one of those traces, the clearest, the most elaborate, the best preserved in Western tradition. But it is not the only one, and each of those traces points in the same direction. Something happened before the flood. Something that involved beings not entirely human. That produced female offspring of extraordinary power, and it was systematically erased from the official records for reasons that we can only infer from the fragments. The story they buried was not a myth, it was a record, and Medusa was one of its most important chapters. The chapter that the Greeks translated into the only language their culture could use, the language of the gods. But behind the snakes, the petrifying gaze, and the bronze shield, there is something that the Greeks did not name. There is a woman, or something that resembled a woman, something that carried in its blood a secret prior to all history, something that the Watchers transmitted when they descended, something that the flood could not completely extinguish, something that survived in the confines, in the depths, in the margins where the control of order does not reach. And that Perseus, armed by the gods of Olympus, was sent to destroy before anyone could recognize him. The final question is not whether Medusa was real. The final question is what she knew that made it so necessary to silence her. That question leads to the same texts that lead to the Watchers, to Mount Hermon, and to the silence of Genesis. But the story of Medusa does not end with her death. It ends with the dispersion of something that cannot be destroyed. The severed head was delivered to Athena, who placed it right in the center of her divine aegis as a weapon. The goddess of wisdom used the power of a hybrid as a shield. That only makes sense if the power was genuine. What has no real power is not used as a weapon. Athena knew this, and that is why she preserved what Perseus destroyed. In the apocryphal texts, the knowledge of the Watchers was not completely erased. It was redirected and recoded. The fallen angels transmitted knowledge that later texts attributed to authorized divine sources. Knowledge survived in a different form. It changed its bearer, but its origin remained the same as always. Medusa was destroyed, but her power continued to act through Athena's aegis for centuries and centuries more. Exactly as the spirits of the Nephilim continued to act on Earth after their bodies were destroyed. The pattern is perfect, too perfect to be a coincidence, too precise to be mere poetic chance. What the apocryphal texts call the spirits of the Nephilim, the Greeks referred to as the power of Athena's aegis. Two distinct traditions, two completely different cultural languages, one underlying and identical truth. And that truth is what the guardians of official knowledge have preferred to keep hidden all this time. Because recognizing it would require reviewing the very foundations of the religious and cultural history of all humanity. It is not a minor adjustment. It is a fundamental review of who we are and where what we call knowledge comes from. That is the reason why Medusa was turned into a monster and why her story remains so necessary. Subscribe now to continue uncovering the mysteries that ancient texts have silently preserved for us. If this story has opened something in your understanding of ancient texts, subscribe to keep discovering it.